A European airliner was hijacked by a neighboring government. Hi there, thanks for joining us for Plain English, where we explore current events and trending topics at a speed that's just right for English learners. I'm Jeff. JR is the producer, and this full lesson is available at plainenglish.com/372. The full lesson includes a transcript of the program, quizzes, exercises, a how-to video, and much more. Plain English Plus members also get translations of keywords into 9 languages. Coming up today, a terrifying story from the eastern frontier of Europe. An airplane carrying 126 passengers from Athens, Greece to Vilnius, Lithuania, was diverted by a military fighter plane as it flew through Belarus's airspace. The passengers were detained in Minsk for 7 hours, while the government supposedly investigated a bomb threat. But the bomb threat was a ruse. The diversion was engineered by the Belarusian government to arrest an opposition activist. In the second half of today's lesson, we'll talk about the phrasal verb cover up, and we have a quote of the week. A Ryanair flight from Greece to Lithuania was hijacked by the government of Belarus. At 12:30 p.m. on May 23rd, Ryanair flight 4978, traveling over Belarus, received a message from the Belarusian government that there was a bomb threat against the plane. The bomb, the message said, would be activated when the plane reached its destination, Vilnius, Lithuania. As a security precaution, the flight would have to be diverted to Minsk, the capital of Belarus, even though that was not the nearest airport. A fighter jet from the Belarusian army was scrambled to intercept the plane and make sure it landed in Minsk. The cabin crew made the announcement and the flight changed course at 12:46. Most passengers were concerned, but one passenger was terrified. 26-year-old Roman Protasevich knew something terrible was about to happen. He suspected that the diversion was not about a bomb. He feared it was really a ploy to arrest him, and he was right. When the plane landed, the Belarusian authorities escorted passengers off the aircraft in small groups. They searched the plane for a bomb. They spread out all the checked luggage on the tarmac and used trained dogs to sniff for explosives. They interviewed the people aboard. There was no bomb, however, nor was there any threat of a bomb. It was all a ruse, elaborate theater, to cover up the fact that Belarus wanted to arrest one of the passengers aboard. After 7 hours, the flight was cleared to leave Belarus and continue on to Vilnius. Protasevich and his girlfriend were not on board. Belarus is a former Soviet republic on Europe's eastern border. It is not part of the EU. It is led by Alexander Lukashenko, nicknamed Europe's last dictator. He won what may have been a legitimate election to be president of the newly independent Belarus in 1994. But he wasted no time in tearing up any semblance of democratic legitimacy. Today, he rules as an authoritarian, faking election results, imprisoning and torturing his opposition, and repressing free speech. He was up for election again in 2020 when he faced a protest movement against his rule. When the government announced Lukashenko had won a sixth term, the protests only got bigger. Both the US and Europe declared the elections were not free or fair and called on Lukashenko to step down and allow a free election. Fearing for her life and the lives of her children, the leader of the opposition fled to neighboring Lithuania. The protests on the streets grew to become the biggest anti-government protests in Belarus's history. Lukashenko brutally cracked down. Police used tear gas, water cannons, stun grenades, batons, and rubber bullets against protesters. They arrested people indiscriminately and tortured them. It was worse for protest leaders, some of whom were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. The repression extended to the press. The army fired rubber bullets at journalists, smashed their cameras, confiscated memory cards, shut down websites, arrested and physically abused journalists. International correspondents from the BBC, Associated Press, and European outlets were expelled from the country. Exhausted by the hard work of repression, Belarus's government decided there would be no more independent journalism inside its borders. Starting in October 2020, the government said all journalists would be licensed by the state. This is the environment in which Roman Protasevich worked. He is the leader of Nexta, a channel with over 2 million subscribers on the social media site Telegram. The channel features user-generated photos, videos, and stories from the protests. It was one of the few places to get legitimate information during the protests. Protasevich lived in exile in Lithuania. He knew he would be arrested if he ever set foot in Lukashenko's Belarus. What he didn't know is that he'd be arrested for simply flying through Belarusian airspace. He had been in Athens to attend an economic conference and was flying directly from the conference back home to Lithuania. Though both Greece and Lithuania are EU member states, the flight between the two countries passes through Belarusian airspace. Roman Protasevich now faces 15 years in prison in Belarus. Obviously under duress, he appeared on state television with bruises on his head and neck, stating that he had been treated fairly. The hijacking was a stunning act even by the standards of the modern strongman. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, called the hijacking utterly unacceptable. The governments of Lithuania, Greece, Poland, Germany, France, Ireland, and others condemned the action and called for a strong response. The U.S. Secretary of State called it a brazen and shocking act. Ryanair's boss called it aviation piracy. The United Nations agency in charge of air travel says the act may have violated the Chicago Convention, an agreement governing international aviation. The EU is considering adding to its sanctions that it had already imposed after the 2020 sham election. The US has already extended its sanctions. Ukraine stopped buying electricity generated in Belarus in response. Not everyone was against the hijacking. A leader of RT, the Russian government's international mouthpiece, said she was jealous of Belarus and said Lukashenko had played it beautifully. A member of Russia's parliament called the move a brilliant special operation. Russia's foreign minister took the occasion to affirm that Russia and Belarus share common history and spiritual values. This seems to be another chapter in a worrying trend of dictator governments taking vengeance on opponents, even if it means infringing on the sovereignty of other countries. It reminds me of when the Saudi government murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi in its consulate in Istanbul, another case where they somewhat feebly tried to cover up their involvement. I can't believe this guy is 26 years old, too, Roman Protasevich. He is extremely brave. The world knows his name now. He is in for some tough times at the hands of the Belarusian government. If there is one silver lining, it's that he's now too famous to be assassinated, kind of like Alexei Navalny in Russia. It's time for today's expression. We are going to talk about the phrasal verb cover up. To cover something up is to hide the truth about something unethical or illegal. There are several ways to cover something up. You could hide the evidence. You could force others to lie. You could distract the world from your unethical deeds. You could fabricate evidence that hides what you did wrong. In today's lesson, you heard that Belarus's government hijacked a commercial airliner passing through its airspace. The country's objective was to arrest a journalist on board. This was a serious breach of international norms and probably a UN convention. Belarus tried to cover this up by saying they had gotten a bomb threat and were searching for explosives. They called the journalist Roman Protasevich a terrorist and arrested him. It's what they always wanted to do. But there was never a bomb. There was never a bomb threat. That was all an attempt to cover up the arrest of a journalist. Belarus may have attempted to conceal its true motives or hide its illegal behavior, but nobody was fooled. This is an example where someone tried to cover up a crime by creating a distraction. In many cases, though, a person covers up a crime by tampering with evidence or convincing someone to lie. In the English county of Merseyside, 2 police officers are accused of covering up a crime by another officer. According to the charges, one police officer illegally assaulted a citizen. That was the original crime. 2 other police officers tried to cover it up. They lied about the incident. One said that his body camera was not working when it actually was working. The other 2 officers were covering up the crime of their fellow officer by lying about the incident and about their body cameras. In the United States, a man was driving on the road and he hit a teenage girl, killing her. Witnesses say they saw a car damaged as if by a crash, but the owner of the car quickly cleaned it and made some repairs so that police wouldn't suspect that he was the hit-and-run driver. He tried to cover it up. He tried to cover up the crime. But a deeper analysis of the car showed that the damage was consistent with a hit-and-run accident, and the man was arrested. One of the most famous crimes, perhaps the most famous crime in American history, involves the president covering up an illegal act. This is a long story, but I'll give you the short version. In spring of 1972, people connected to the President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the offices of the opposition party and wiretapped phones, an illegal act. The president, though, spent months trying to cover up his campaign's involvement in the break-in. He used his power to hamper the investigation. He lied about his campaign's knowledge of the break-in, and he released audio tapes of his conversations with a famous 18.5-minute gap in the recording. Nixon was later forced to resign, the only president in our history to have resigned. The ironic thing is that prosecutors in the case were convinced that the president himself wasn't guilty at the beginning. Theories abound, but even many of his opponents say Nixon didn't even know about the break-in beforehand. It was only after he tried to cover up the crime that he got in trouble. Today's quote is extremely famous in English. It's sadly appropriate for today's lesson. It's by a British politician, Lord Acton. He said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." The quote is often shortened to say, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely." In this case, absolute power means total power, or someone who has total control over a country or organization. And if absolute or total power corrupts absolutely, it means that person grows to be completely corrupt as he gains more power. And that seems to indeed have been the case with the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko. And that is all for today. Congratulations on making it to the end of yet another lesson. Remember, there's always more online. Plain English Plus members can listen to the fast version of this lesson, test their listening skills, practice their pronunciation, and take the lesson quiz. We also have a how-to video today about how to use the word nor. I bet some of you have seen that word and you don't quite know how to use it. Well, that's what our how-to videos are for. I take you through exactly how to use nor in a sentence, and I give you the opportunity to practice right along with me. That's all at plainenglish.com/372. And if you're not yet a Plain English Plus member, you can join at plainenglish.com/plus, plainenglish.com/PLUS.